Hello, and welcome to Soulspeak. Today, we step back into the fog-covered streets of London, in the year 1888, a time when horse-drawn carriages ruled the roads, and darkness wasn't just the absence of light, but a living, breathing thing. In the slums of Whitechapel, life was fragile. The poor slept shoulder to shoulder in overcrowded lodgings, the air thick with coal smoke and despair. Women walked the alleys at night, trading their safety for a few pennies, and some never came home. That autumn, the city trembled as bodies began to surface, each discovery more brutal than the last. Throats slit, bodies mutilated, precision so sharp it seemed almost surgical. The killer vanished after every strike, leaving nothing but silence and terror behind. The newspapers called him a madman, the people called him a monster. History would remember him by a name scribbled in red ink: Jack the Ripper. Tonight on Soulspeak, we revisit the case that redefined fear, a story of blood, mystery, and obsession, one that still haunts London's shadowed alleys more than a century later. Because sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't found in the dark. They are the dark. A cold light crawled over Whitechapel that morning. Gas lamps struggled against a low, wet fog. The cobbles shone slick with coal smoke and rain. Early workers pushed past bundled figures returning from night shifts. Somewhere down a narrow alley, a constable's call echoed and then faded into the damp air. It was a city that rose and breathed through its streets, and on that autumn morning in 1888, the streets themselves felt watched. Whitechapel sat at the eastern edge of London's great expansion. Factories and docks had built wealth for some, but they had built slums for many more. Tenements pressed together like stacked boxes, their rooms overcrowded and poorly ventilated. Cholera, tuberculosis, and malnutrition were routine threats. The poor paid for the city's prosperity with their health and safety. For women who had no other options, the streets at night offered a way to survive. For others, boarding houses and casual labor barely kept hunger at bay. Into that pressure cooker of poverty and anonymity came a string of violent crimes that would unnerve a nation. The victims were, by and large, women who walked the midnight streets of Whitechapel. Their lives were precarious and their social standing precariously low. In Victorian London, a woman's virtue was a public measure of her worth. A prostitute, however desperate, was commonly dismissed as morally suspect and therefore less deserving of vigilance or sympathy. That widespread bias shaped how authorities and press covered the crimes and how quickly the public's fear intensified. Policing, in 1888, had grown from a Victorian experiment into a sprawling apparatus, but it still lacked the scientific tools modern investigators take for granted. The Metropolitan Police were organized, professional, and stretched thin across a booming capital. Crime scene protocol, as it would be understood today, did not exist. Evidence preservation was haphazard. Witnesses were interviewed without standardized methods. Forensic pathology was rudimentary. Detectives relied heavily on witness statements, crude measurements, and the judgment of experienced officers. In an environment where fog could erase a suspect's trail and crowds could scatter or mislead, these limitations mattered. The press filled the vacuum left by imperfect policing. Newspapers competed fiercely for readers, printing lurid details and sensational headlines that sold papers by stoking fear. Editors coined nicknames and chased leads, often amplifying rumor into perceived fact. The intense media attention had two effects. It pushed police to act under public pressure, and it created a feedback loop of anxiety that spread far beyond the East End. Readers in London's wealthier districts consumed the same stories and felt, for the first time, that the shadow of violence could reach them too. Within Whitechapel there were other, quieter pressures at play. Immigration had altered the neighborhood's makeup. Recent arrivals from Ireland, Eastern Europe and elsewhere lived side by side with long-established residents. Cultural tensions, language barriers and economic competition produced friction. In certain quarters, suspicion of outsiders surfaced quickly, and perpetrators were sometimes assumed to belong to the newest arrivals. That social instability complicated investigations. Witness statements could be unreliable due to fear or mistrust, and community cooperation with authorities was inconsistent. The cumulative effect was an environment ripe for panic. Poverty made people vulnerable, overcrowding made crimes easier to conceal, and social bias made some victims easier to ignore. Against this backdrop, a small number of murders began to register as something more than isolated tragedies. The pattern murders occurring at night, victims found with similar wounds, and the apparent skill of the attacker demanded attention from investigators and curiosity from the public. No one at the time could have anticipated how those early reports would escalate into a national obsession. What seemed, at first, like a grim local problem quickly became that rarest of stories, a crime that exposed the city's blind spots and gripped it with dread. In the fog of Whitechapel, ordinary life and extraordinary violence met, and the name that would come to mark that collision, a name written in headlines and whispered in alleyways, had not yet been spoken aloud. It began quietly, no headlines, no panic, no name yet whispered through London's streets. In the early hours of August 7, 1888, the residents of George Yard buildings in Whitechapel woke to the sound of footsteps echoing through the stairwell. It was 4:45 in the morning when a young soldier, heading to work, stumbled upon what he first thought was a drunk woman passed out on the landing. When he drew closer, the truth revealed itself in a flash of horror. Lying on her back, her skirt pulled above her waist, was the lifeless body of Martha Tabram. She was 38 years old, a woman hardened by poverty, alcoholism, and nights spent trading her safety for coins. To the people of Whitechapel, she was just another unfortunate face in the crowd, one of many who lived and died unnoticed. But to the constable who arrived minutes later, the scene was unlike anything he had witnessed before. Blood-stained, the wooden steps, pooling beneath her shoulders and dripping slowly down the stairwell. The body was riddled with 39 stab wounds, the violence so ferocious it suggested not a moment of rage but an extended frenzy. Her throat had been slashed repeatedly, her chest and abdomen punctured over and over, and her womb had been stabbed 5 times, as though the killer sought to erase her womanhood itself. Investigators worked under the dim glow of lanterns. There were no signs of theft. Her few coins remained in her pocket, her clothes roughly arranged as if the killer had not cared to hide his work. Witnesses in the building offered fragments of noise and shadow, a woman's faint cry sometime after 2 a.m., footsteps on the stairwell, a muttered male voice. Yet in Whitechapel, such sounds were common arguments, drunken laughter, the crash of bottles. No one thought to intervene. The post-mortem confirmed what the eyes already knew. This had been a deliberate, brutal act. The sheer number of stab wounds was unusual. Serial killers, as the term would later be coined, were not yet part of police vocabulary, but detectives recognized a method far more violent than a robbery or a domestic quarrel. The attack required time, privacy, and either cold control or complete madness. Attention quickly turned to soldiers stationed nearby. 2 men had been seen drinking with Martha the previous night, and both matched general descriptions given by witnesses. One patrol officer even recalled seeing a man in uniform loitering near George Yard around 2:30 a.m. clean-shaven, white, in his 20s, his demeanor calm yet restless. Questioned later at his barracks, the soldiers denied involvement, providing alibis that seemed to hold, without physical evidence or reliable witness identification. The line of inquiry collapsed. For a brief moment, the murder stirred whispers in the East End but little beyond. Whitechapel saw violence often. A woman found dead in a stairwell was tragedy, not necessarily news. The London Star printed a small column, lamenting the cruelty of slum life, but suggesting that such crimes were inevitable consequences of moral decay. The tone was not outrage, but resignation. Among the working class, the sentiment was simpler. The police would not care because the victim was poor. Still, some officers were unsettled by the scene's precision. The wounds were concentrated and systematic, suggesting a familiarity with anatomy or at least an understanding of how to inflict maximum pain. One inspector privately wondered if the killer had used 2 weapons, a small knife and a longer blade. Others dismissed the speculation as overthinking. In the East End, cruelty rarely required explanation. As days passed without an arrest, Martha Tabram's name faded from conversation. Her burial was modest, attended by a handful of neighbors and her estranged partner. There was no memorial, no headline justice, no resolution. Within weeks, the case file was quietly marked unsolved. In the collective memory of London, it became another sad entry in a police ledger already too long. But history would not forget her so easily. Looking back, criminologists and historians now see Martha Tabram as the likely first victim of the man the world would come to know as Jack the Ripper. The signs were there: a nighttime attack, a woman of the streets, a killer who struck with surgical obsession and then vanished into the fog. At the time, no one could connect the dots. It was August in Whitechapel, after all, the kind of place where death was part of the noise. Yet beneath that indifference, something darker was beginning to move. A pattern was forming, silent and patient, waiting for its next opportunity. In less than a month, London would realize that Martha's murder had not been an isolated act of madness. It had been a beginning, the first shadow cast by a monster who had just stepped into the light. The pattern sharpened through August and September of 1888, where Martha Tabram's death might once have been written off as another tragic instance of street violence. The next 4 killings presented a continuity that could not be ignored. Each crime shared time, place, and victim profile: late-night attacks in the maze of Whitechapel, women living on the margins, wounds suggesting a violent intimacy. But as the murders continued, the brutality intensified, and with brutality came clues that would both point and mislead investigators for decades. Mary Ann Nichols was found on the morning of August 31, 1888, in a narrow lane called Bucks Row. The body lay face up by the gate of a stable yard. The street was still shadowed, and smells of horse and coal hung in the air. Neighbors reported little: a few footsteps, a door closing at odd hours, the muffled sounds of a city that slept poorly. Nichols, known locally and by the police as Polly, was in her early 40s, a woman worn by poverty and broken by circumstance. Her throat had been cut deeply from left to right. The wound had caused rapid, lethal blood loss. The abdomen had also been slashed, and crude mutilations exposed internal organs. The direction of the throat cut from left to right struck some observers as a detail that might reveal the killer's handedness. To the officers on a still new field of criminal investigation, such specifics were tantalizing and, perhaps, misleading. A left-to-right incision suggested a left-handed attacker, or a right-hander approaching from a certain angle. Either way, it hinted at an intent and an ease that separated this killing from a drunken quarrel or a random mugging. Only a week later, on September 8th, the body of Annie Chapman was discovered in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street. The scene was more gruesome and, in its way, more methodical. Chapman's throat had been cut cleanly. The abdomen was opened and the internal organs disturbed. Most chilling of all, parts of her reproductive organs were removed. The pathologist's report would later note the precision of certain incisions and the removal of tissues in ways that suggested deliberate knowledge of internal anatomy. Neighbors told similar stories they had told after Nichols's murder: muffled cries, the sound of someone leaving hurriedly, a retreat into indifference that was typical in a neighborhood where trouble was common and intervention dangerous. One witness later reported seeing Chapman speaking with a man shortly before her death. His description, a dark-coated figure, hat low, was frustratingly generic. The discovery of Chapman's body triggered a more vigorous response. Newspapers that had earlier relegated such deaths to the back pages now led with lurid headlines. A pattern of young poor women found at dawn, mutilated and abandoned, could not be dismissed as the random cruelties of squalor. Detectives began to consider the possibility of a single perpetrator. The focus on anatomy deepened. Medical vocabulary entered police reports and public discourse. Some officers suggested the killer might be a surgeon or slaughterhouse worker, someone accustomed to cutting flesh in neat, practiced motions. Others warned against overreaching. In an age before forensic standards, many knife-wielding men could produce wounds that looked clinical to an untrained eye. The most disturbing night came on September 30th, a night that would enter the record as the double event. In the space of hours, 2 women were found murdered in separate districts of London. The first was Elizabeth Stride, discovered in Dutfield's Yard, off Berner Street. Her death was brutal but unusual in one respect. Her body bore a fatal throat wound but lacked the extensive abdominal mutilation seen in the previous killings. The truncated violence suggested interruption. Perhaps Stride had been attacked and her killer was frightened off, forced to flee before he could finish. That theory gained weight when, within the hour and less than a mile away, the mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square, in the City of London. Eddowes had been savagely disfigured. Her abdomen had been opened and a kidney removed and taken away. The removal of an organ elevated the crimes from violent homicides to something more grotesquely intentional. A crucial, yet ambiguous, clue emerged that night. Near where Eddowes' apron, stained with blood, was later found in Galston Street. A chalked message on a wall read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The location of this scroll, and the proximity of the bloody cloth to the scroll, forced a difficult decision upon the police. Fearing anti-Semitic rioting in an already tense city, the superintendent ordered the writing erased before it could be properly documented, a decision that would be criticized later as destroying potential evidence. The cloth itself was preserved and linked to Eddowes through blood and other traces. But whether the wall message was left by the killer, a frightened witness, or a random vandal remains unresolved. The episode exposed more than a possible perpetrator's trail. It revealed how social tensions, immigration, poverty, prejudice could distort an investigation at every turn. Each murder that autumn showed both continuity and variation, which complicated profiling. The killer chose vulnerable women, struck at night in labyrinthine alleys, and often inflicted throat wounds. But the extralegal signature, mutilation, and organ removal varied in degree. Some historians and analysts have argued that the killer learned and adapted, experimenting with methods when privacy and opportunity allowed. Others suggest he might have been a professional whose circumstances only sometimes permitted the time necessary for extensive mutilation. Theories abounded: a surgeon turned butcher, a sailor familiar with knives, a mentally unwell loner who had developed a ritual. The brutal reality was that the knife work, when present, displayed a confidence unknown to most opportunistic attackers. Incisions were often precise, and in at least 2 cases an organ was removed and taken away. The final, most grotesque killing occurred on November 9, 1888, in a single rented room in Miller's Court, there, in the compact privacy that the killer had likely craved. Mary Jane Kelly, perhaps the youngest of the canonical victims, was found in a condition that defied most previous comparisons. The room's thin walls and the close, cramped quarters meant the killer could work uninterrupted. Kelly's face was mutilated beyond recognition. Her body was extensively disemboweled, and organs lay spread about the bed and floor. The scale of the violence suggested both an escalation and an intimacy. It was as though the murderer had finally been granted the time and solitude to enact the fullest version of his intent. Police later described the scene as an atrocity that went beyond homicide into ritualistic desecration. Together, these 4 murders, Nichols, Chapman, Stride and Eidos, the double event, and Kelly, formed a sequence that looked outwardly coherent but left room for many interpretations. In each case, the victims were women who occupied the precarious spaces of urban poverty. In several cases, witnesses placed them with men shortly before their deaths. The recurring choice of victims pointed to predatory behavior. The killer sought those least likely to be missed, whose disappearances would be delayed or dismissed. Yet the variation in mutilation, the differences in location and timing, and the lack of definitive physical evidence complicated any single narrative. From an investigative standpoint, the murders revealed the limits of Victorian policing. Crime scene preservation was minimal. Bystanders, curious and fearful, trod through alleys before officers arrived, contaminating footprints and moving potential evidence. Forensic science, in its infancy, could only say so much. A wound was deep, an organ missing, but linking day-to-day policing to a suspect required more substantial proof than the era provided. Newspaper sensationalism, meanwhile, raised public pressure and produced copycat letters and hoaxes that further muddied the waters. The police had to balance genuine leads with a flood of misinformation, and they did so in an environment charged with class resentment and ethnic tension. Viewed together, the sequenced murders illustrate a chilling evolution. Where the first killings might be attributed to the brutal realities of slum life, the later crimes suggested deliberation, an escalation of method, and the possibility of expertise. Whether the killer's knowledge came from training, practice, or grim intuition was a question that would haunt investigators long after the bodies stopped appearing. The Whitechapel murders did not merely add names to a ledger. They exposed a predator who moved from alley to room to myth, leaving behind wounds, whispers, and a pattern that would define the case for centuries to come. The murders in Whitechapel produced more than blood and fear. They produced words, urgent, mocking, and grotesque, sent through the same postal system that bound Victorian Britain together. Within weeks of the killings, letters began to arrive at police stations and newspaper offices. Among hundreds of scribbles and cruel jokes, 3 communications stood out and would shape the case's public face: the Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jack postcard, and the Chilling from Hell letter that arrived accompanied by a half of a preserved human kidney. Together they vaulted the murders from local horror into national spectacle, and they introduced a persona the press and the public would never forget: the Dear Boss. Letter arrived in late September 1888. Written with a sardonic, theatrical flourish, it claimed responsibility for the murders and signed off with a name that would cement itself in infamy: Jack the Ripper. The writer taunted the police, jeered at their efforts, and described future deeds in the sort of gleeful voice that made readers both nauseous and fascinated. Whether the document came from the killer, a fantasist, or a journalist seeking a scoop, its effect was immediate. Newspapers seized on the name, and the signature Jack gave the public an easy, terrifying label for an otherwise anonymous horror. In effect, a single piece of ink created the principal face of the crimes, an eliding of method and motive into a single, memorable villain. Not long after, the Saucy Jack postcard arrived, written in similar cocky tones and referencing what the writer called the double event, the night when two women were murdered in separate locations. The postcard's allusion to the double killings suggested inside knowledge and, for many readers, reinforced the idea of a single cunning perpetrator working across London. Yet police and later scholars would debate the authenticity of both the postcard and the Dear Boss letter. Many investigators suspected both were hoaxes, perhaps the work of journalists or thrill-seekers attempting to steer headlines. Victorian newspapers, driven by fierce competition, had an incentive to amplify any lead that increased circulation. That incentive blurred the line between genuine intelligence and provocation. The third and most disturbing communication came to be known as the From Hell letter. Its tone was less theatrical and more primitive, its grammar rough, and its crude spelling giving it a vengeance that felt oddly personal. Inside the parcel that accompanied the letter, according to contemporary reports, was half of a human kidney, preserved in spirits. The kidney was subsequently examined by a physician, who speculated that it might have belonged to one of the canonical victims from whom a kidney had been reported missing. For the public, the parcel transforms speculation into a grotesque physical fact. If the organ was real, then the killer had not only murdered, but also taken a piece of his victim as a trophy. The effect on public imagination was catastrophic. Readers were forced to confront the literal, bodily proof of monstrous intent. So why did these letters, however dubious their provenance, gain such traction? Part of the answer lies in the era's media ecosystem. The Victorian press was voracious and sensational. It competed in a market that rewarded lurid copy. Editors printed the letters, not merely as reportage, but as narrative, an unfolding serial in ink. Readers consumed the letters like episodes, filling the gaps left by scarce forensic certainty with drama and motive. A signed confession or something that looked like one, felt like a piece of truth in a landscape, otherwise built on rumor and fragmentary testimony. Human psychology also played a role. People crave names. Naming simplifies the unknowable. Jack the Ripper reduced a chaotic series of crimes to a single identity, which allowed the public to assign responsibility and to tell a coherent story. The letters provided personality, sarcasm, cruelty, defiance, traits that made the killer, at least in the popular imagination, comprehensible and therefore conquerable. The letters also inflamed fear by personalization. A taunting voice suggested not just opportunity but malice that could be directed at anyone. Finally, the letters show how communication can alter an investigation. Police resources were diverted to authenticate correspondence. Time was spent tracking postmarks and handwriting instead of focusing solely on physical leads, and public pressure amplified by headlines quoting the letters shaped priorities. The flood of correspondence also produced a practical problem. For every plausible letter there were dozens more hoaxes, sifting signal from noise taxed, a force already constrained by limited scientific methods. In retrospect, the letters were as much cultural artifacts as potential evidence. Whether authored by the killer or by opportunists, they did what few physical clues could. They gave the crimes a voice and a myth. That myth, Jack the Ripper, would outlive most of the contemporaneous leads and suspects. Even today, the letters are studied not only for forensic content but for what they reveal about a society already anxious, fascinated, and eager for a story to explain its worst fears. When the Whitechapel killings escalated, the Metropolitan Police responded with unprecedented activity. Patrols were increased across the East End. Plainclothes officers and constables walked the alleys in greater numbers, and detectives canvassed lodging houses and hospitals. Records show thousands of interviews logged in the weeks that followed. Investigators questioned more than 2,000 people, tenants, laborers, sailors, doctors, and boarding house keepers, chasing fragments of time and shadow. Yet volume did not equal clarity. Many statements contradicted each other. Many alibis could not be independently verified, and the fog of rumor thickened as quickly as the London mist. The sheer scale of the inquiry strained an organization built for a different era of crime. Public pressure compounded operational difficulty. Sensational newspaper coverage demanded answers. Editors printed lurid details, speculated about suspects, and often accused the police of incompetence. The outcry reached the highest levels. Queen Victoria and other figures in the establishment were informed and expressed alarm about conditions in the docks and the effect on national reputation. There were even private communications urging a swift resolution. The intervention of prominent voices intensified scrutiny but did not necessarily supply better leads. Instead, It created political urgency that sometimes prioritized visible action over careful detective work. Faced with a mounting caseload and a nervous public, police and experts generated a set of dominant hypotheses about who might be responsible. One school pointed to medical training. The apparent precision of some incisions and the removal of organs suggested someone with anatomical knowledge, a surgeon, a medical student, or a surgical assistant. This hypothesis drove investigators to canvass hospitals and surgical suppliers, to interview doctors, and to inspect the records of those in medical professions who lived or worked near Whitechapel. Another theory focused on butchers and slaughterhouse workers who had both knives and a routine familiarity with cutting animal flesh. The docks and meat markets were full of men who could wield a blade with practiced force. A third, and frequently floated, idea was that of a transient sailor or itinerant laborer, men who came and went with ships, who were in London on weekends, and who could vanish beyond jurisdictional bounds when suspicion heated. Each hypothesis made tactical sense, but none produced a convincing suspect. Technical limitations compounded the problem. Forensic science in 1888 was rudimentary. There was no fingerprint classification system in everyday use, no DNA testing, and limited capacity for accurate time-of-death estimation. Crime scene procedures were ad hoc, cordons were porous, and curious bystanders often trod through potential evidence before officers could respond. Biological specimens were sometimes mishandled or lost. Even basic documentation suffered. Inconsistent note-taking, incomplete sketches, and poor chain of custody practices meant that physical traces that later generations could have re-examined were often irretrievable or contaminated. Human error and institutional blind spots aggravated technical deficits. Some decisions, made under pressure, proved costly. Officers erased potential evidence in the belief it would prevent communal violence. Records were filed without full cross-checking, and at times the police hierarchy failed to coordinate between units responsible for different districts. Local tensions between immigrant communities and native residents, between East End committees and officialdom, inhibited cooperation. Witnesses feared speaking out for economic or ethnic reasons. Distrust of authority meant that crucial accounts were delayed or withheld. All of this occurred against a backdrop of class bias. Victims who were sex workers received less public sympathy and, critics argue, less investigative intensity than they might have if they had been from more privileged strata. Another complicating factor was deliberate misinformation. As the case captured the public imagination, hoax letters and false confessions began to arrive by the dozen. Journalists sometimes fed these hoaxes into circulation, and some correspondents manufactured drama to sell papers. Police time and resources were diverted to authenticate letters and trace their origins. Each diversion diluted investigative focus. Moreover, competing jurisdictions, the Metropolitan Police, the City of London Police, and local constabularies, sometimes jostled over responsibility and evidence. Coordination was imperfect, and jurisdictional ambiguity hindered unified strategies. Investigators did, however, take practical steps that reflected the best available reasoning of their time. Patrol patterns were altered, reward offers were posted to incentivize informants, and the police sought cooperation from military barracks, hospitals, and lodging house proprietors. Detectives followed dozens of promising leads, interrogated suspects, and collected tangible items for inspection. But the case suffered from too many plausible leads and too little conclusive linkage. Without a decisive piece of evidence, a reliable eyewitness identification, a weapon conclusively tied to a suspect, or a preserved item with an indisputable chain to the killer, prosecutions could not proceed. By the end of 1888, the killings that had terrified London's autumn had ceased with no conviction. Investigations continued in varying forms for years. Suspects were questioned, inquiries reopened, and new theories proposed. Yet the trail grew cold. Some explanations for the end of the murders were practical. The killer may have died, been imprisoned for another offense, or left the country. Other explanations were less satisfying. The killer may simply have stopped, for reasons unknown. For the police, the lack of resolution was bitter, an emblem of institutional limits when confronted by a predator who exploited anonymity, the city's labyrinth, and the era's scientific gaps. The result was a professional and public humiliation for Victorian policing and an enduring mystery for criminology. Jack, the name given by the press and by a letter, slunk back into the fog of history as abruptly as he had appeared. The investigations revealed strengths in Victorian detective craft, but they also exposed a cascade of limitations: technological, procedural, political, and cultural. Those limitations left London with questions that would echo for generations, shaping both the mythology of the case and the evolution of modern forensic practice. As the killings hardened into a pattern, police and public alike grasped for names. Over the decades, dozens of individuals have been proposed as potential perpetrators, but 5 suspects recur most often in scholarship and popular accounts. Each candidate presents a mix of motive, opportunity, and circumstantial evidence, and each carries problems that prevent definitive attribution. Examining them side by side helps explain why the case has remained open to debate for so long. Montague. John Druitt first entered the suspect lists because of timing and temperament. A barrister and schoolteacher from a respectable family, Druitt disappeared in December 1888 and was later found drowned in the Thames. His suicide occurred within weeks of the last canonical murder. Those who favor Druitt point to his sudden disappearance. Rumors of mental instability and a perceived break with normal life that could match a violent impulse. Against him stand weaknesses. There is no concrete physical evidence tying him to Whitechapel, and many of the connections are retrospective gossip supplied by acquaintances after his death. Moreover, Druitt's social standing and occupational obligations make a sustained nocturnal predation pattern harder to reconcile without clear supporting testimony. Francis Tumblety offers a very different profile. An American quack doctor with a documented fixation on female anatomy and a public history of odd, aggressive behavior toward women. He was in London during the murders and later fled to the United States under circumstances that attracted suspicion. Proponents highlight his documented misogyny and a grotesque collection that at times included medical specimens. Yet Tumblety's case is undermined by conflicting accounts about his whereabouts during specific murders and by the often sensationalist sources that fuel his notoriety. Without verifiable presence at crime scenes or a forensic link, the argument rests largely on character and opportunity rather than hard proof. The case of Syrinka Lasowski George Chapman is compelling because of his violent later history. Chapman emigrated from Poland, worked in Whitechapel, and was convicted for poisoning and murdering multiple wives in the years that followed. His proximity to the area and his proven capacity for murder mark him as plausible. Some investigators have argued that his knowledge of anatomy and a potential pattern of escalating violence could align with the Ripper crimes. On the other hand, the method differs significantly. Chapman preferred poison rather than knives, and his confirmed crimes postdate the Ripper murders. The dissimilarity of modus operandi and lack of direct evidence linking Chapman to the Whitechapel wounds weaken the hypothesis. Among the more dramatic theories is the Dr. William Gole hypothesis. Gole was a respected physician to the royal household, and the theory that he was the Ripper stems from conspiratorial accounts that weave Freemasonry, aristocratic secrecy, and alleged protection by powerful figures into a grand narrative. Advocates cite Gole's medical expertise as an explanation for the perceived precision of some mutilations and note that Gole's social position could shield him from suspicion. Skeptics point out that the theory relies heavily on speculative interpretation of scant, circumstantial evidence, invents motives tied to royal scandal, and privileges sensational storytelling over plausibility. Most mainstream historians regard the Gole theory as an imaginative but unsubstantiated hypothesis. Finally, Aaron Kosminski remains one of the most discussed suspects in modern forensic reconstructions. A Polish-born barber living in Whitechapel, Kosminski was identified in contemporary police papers as a person of interest and later confined to an asylum. In the 21st century, claims emerged that mitochondrial DNA from a shawl associated with one victim matched descendants of Kosminski's family. Supporters argue this provides a biological link that earlier investigators lacked. Critics respond that the shawl's provenance is questionable, that contamination over a century can invalidate DNA results, and that mitochondrial DNA cannot uniquely identify an individual. Thus, while Kosminski is perhaps the strongest candidate to emerge from modern techniques, his candidacy is far from universally accepted. What unites these suspects is not definitive guilt, but a combination of plausible motive, opportunity, and gaps in the historical record that allows speculation to flourish. Each theory explains some elements of the crimes while failing to account for others: timing, specific wound characteristics, the killer's ability to remain at large, and the variations in mutilation across incidents. The differing hypotheses also illustrate common pitfalls in retrospective profiling: the tendency to fit facts to a favored narrative, The influence of social prejudices against immigrants, the mentally ill or unconventional professionals, and the limits of evidence that has been lost, contaminated, or never collected. Equally instructive are what these debates reveal about investigative culture. The drive to find a single villain speaks to a human need for closure and narrative coherence. Over time, media framing, popular books, and speculative documentaries have transformed the case into a mythos in which identity matters less than the story itself. Modern forensic claims, while promising, often rely on materials and documentation whose chain of custody is imperfect. That leaves historians and criminologists in a persistent tension. They can illuminate probabilities and rule out certain scenarios, but they rarely can produce incontrovertible answers. In the end, the canonical truth remains elusive. No suspect has been convicted. No definitive piece of evidence ties any one name to all the crimes. The story of Jack the Ripper persists because the historical record allows multiple competing reconstructions, each plausible in part, each incomplete in whole. The unresolved nature of the case is not simply an archival curiosity. It is the reason the murders still attract serious scholarship and wild speculation alike. The killer's identity, whether ever known or forever anonymous, has become part of the case's enduring power. When the killings finally ceased, London was left not with relief but with unease, a lingering uncertainty that outlasted the blood on Whitechapel's streets. In practical terms, the Ripper murders marked a turning point for British policing. The Metropolitan Police, stung by public criticism and royal scrutiny, began to reconsider the foundations of their investigative methods. The failures of 1888 exposed systemic weaknesses, uncoordinated jurisdictions, poor evidence handling, and inadequate forensic understanding. In the years that followed, these shortcomings prompted reform. Record-keeping became more standardized, crime scene management improved, and by the early 20th century, fingerprinting and forensic pathology were introduced into mainstream police practice. Jack the Ripper, though never caught, indirectly reshaped how detectives thought about crime, turning reactive pursuit into methodical analysis. The case also transformed the relationship between the press, the police, and the public. Newspapers discovered that crime could sell not merely as news but as serialized narrative. The coverage around the murders, frantic, moralizing, and often speculative, pioneered a model of media sensationalism that still defines crime reporting today. The press's role in naming the killer Jack the Ripper created the first global criminal brand, a faceless villain who transcended geography and time. That branding altered cultural language. Ripper became shorthand for both horror and mystery, a template for how society talks about serial violence. Culturally, the murders refused to fade. They fed literature, cinema, music, and art for more than a century. Authors from Arthur Conan Doyle's contemporaries to modern novelists drew on the fear that the Ripper embodied the idea that evil could be intelligent, mobile, and indistinguishable from ordinary life. Filmmakers reimagined him as everything from a tragic genius to a supernatural phantom. Musicians, playwrights, and visual artists reinterpreted the story to probe the boundaries of morality and voyeurism. Each retelling said as much about its own time as about Victorian London, anxieties about class, gender, power, and the unseen violence lurking beneath progress. The myth endured precisely because it evolved. Psychologically, the case struck a chord deeper than mere curiosity about unsolved crime. The Ripper murders confronted the public with the limits of modernity's promise. The idea that science and order could protect civilization from chaos. Here was a city proud of its progress, yet helpless against a killer who exploited its shadows. The fear was not only of death, but of invisibility. The thought that someone could commit unspeakable acts, vanish into fog, and leave nothing but rumor behind. The unknown became more terrifying than the act itself. The killer who was never caught became a symbol of the fragility of certainty, a reminder that evil does not always wear a visible face. That psychological impact extended far beyond London. In criminology, the Ripper became a foundational case study in profiling a model of how environment, victimology, and offender behavior could be analyzed to infer motive and method. In sociology, the murders became evidence of how fear spreads and how societies project moral failure onto the marginalized. And in the study of media, the case illustrated how storytelling could transform real suffering into spectacle, blurring the line between empathy and entertainment. Yet, the most haunting legacy is not procedural or cultural but existential. For all the theories, the documentaries, and the alleged scientific breakthroughs, no one has ever proven who Jack the Ripper was. The void itself became the legend. His silence, the absence of confession, the lack of closure sustains the unease that once gripped the East End. Over a century later, tourists still walk those same streets, tracing the steps of a phantom whose reality is lost to time but whose echo persists. Scholars debate his identity, artists reinvent his image, and the public still whispers his name with equal parts fascination and dread. More than 130 years have passed, and Jack the Ripper still has no face. Perhaps that is what keeps him alive, the idea that anyone, in the right fog, could disappear as completely as he did. In the end, it may not have been the knife that made him unforgettable, but the silence he left behind. His absence, the unanswered question, remains the truest source of terror. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of this episode of Soulspeak. Jack the Ripper's story isn't just about the murders, it's about how mystery, fear, and time can shape history itself. If you made it this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Who do you think Jack the Ripper really was? Do you believe he stopped, or simply changed his name and disappeared? Drop your theories down in the comments. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed diving deep into this case, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you won't miss our next true crime story. This has been Soulspeak, where every mystery has a voice. Until next time, stay curious, and stay safe.